Sandra Bullock stepped into the grand hall of the charity gala, her understated gray dress a stark contrast to the extravagance surrounding her. The room shimmered with the glow of chandeliers, reflecting off the gowns adorned with sequins, jewels, and wealth itself. As she walked, she could feel the weight of society's judgmental gazes, their silent evaluations echoing louder than words. In a quiet corner, two elegantly dressed women clinked their champagne glasses, their whispers laced with amusement. "Look at that outfit." "How embarrassing," one of them scoffed. "This is a gala, not a casual meetup at some roadside diner," the other added with a smug smirk. What they didn't know was that Sandra Bullock wasn't just another guest. She wasn't someone they could belittle and forget. Before the night was over, they would realize they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. And they would pay, not with money, but with their reputations. Because Sandra was the event's lead donor. And she was a close friend of none other than Keanu Reeves, the gala's organizer. What Keanu was about to do would leave them speechless, and Sandra's response. It would be something they would never forget. Before we dive deeper into this jaw-dropping story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow, we have something even more special waiting for you. The grand ballroom was a vision of opulence. Hundreds of dazzling chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, while the air carried the luxurious scent of expensive perfumes and bubbling champagne. It was the social event of the season, attended by Hollywood elites, powerful business moguls, and high society's most influential figures. Women in breathtaking designer gowns glided through the crowd, their diamond necklaces sparkling as they exchanged carefully measured pleasantries with impeccably dressed executives. Outside, the red carpet stretched beneath the flashing cameras, capturing the arrival of high-profile guests in sleek, luxury cars. And then, she arrived. Sandra Bullock stepped out, not from a limousine, not surrounded by an entourage, but from a modest, unassuming car. No bodyguards. No grand entrance. Just quiet confidence. She wore a simple yet elegant gray dress. No extravagant jewelry. No excessive shimmer. Her hair was pulled into a neat updo, her makeup minimal, enhancing her natural beauty. She didn't need to demand attention, it followed her effortlessly. Photographers snapped a few pictures before quickly turning their lenses toward the next arrival. And that's when they stepped onto the red carpet, Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian St. James. Dripping in luxury, their golden gowns shimmered under the camera flashes, oversized diamond jewelry making their status unmistakable. Known not just for their immense wealth, but for their razor-sharp tongues and judgmental stares, they barely concealed their disdain as they passed Sandra. Then came the whispers. Sandra entered the ballroom and felt it immediately, the way people looked at her. These weren't glances of admiration or curiosity. They were assessments. Judgments. Here, appearances were currency. And to them, Sandra wasn't spending enough. She ignored it. She reminded herself why she was here, to support a cause she deeply believed in, to help raise funds for children in need. But then, she heard it. Poor Sandra. Did no one tell her this was a gala, not a casual dinner? The voice dripped with false sweetness. Eleanor Cartwright. Beside her, Vivian smirked, her voice laced with mock sympathy. "I do admire the effort, really. But some people just don't understand the kind of environment they're in." Sandra felt her stomach tighten. She wasn't naive. She knew how superficial some circles could be. But hearing them speak as if she were invisible, that was something else. She didn't react. She simply took a sip of her champagne and walked away. But the night was far from over. As Sandra moved through the ballroom, engaging in polite conversations, she started noticing a pattern. The most powerful guests barely acknowledged her presence, not out of dislike, but because, in the unspoken hierarchy of the evening, she simply wasn't important enough. A moment of discomfort hit her, but she pushed it aside. "I'm here for the cause," she reminded herself. Then, a waiter approached her with a hesitant whisper. "Excuse me, Miss Bullock, but your seating arrangement has been changed." She frowned. Changed? To where? The waiter hesitated before responding. A secondary table. For a split second, Sandra felt the sting of the moment. She hadn't just been ignored, she had been deliberately sidelined. And she knew exactly who was behind it. From across the room, Eleanor and Vivian exchanged smug, satisfied glances. Sandra took a deep breath and walked toward her new seat, placed far from the main stage, practically exiled from the evening's elite. But as she moved, she noticed something. Eleanor and Vivian were watching. Waiting. Waiting to see if she would falter. If she would bow her head and accept their silent verdict. What they didn't know was that Sandra Bullock had nothing to prove to anyone. And they were about to learn that in the most unforgettable way. What happens next will leave you speechless. And Keanu Reeves? His reaction will change everything. Stay tuned, because this night is just getting started. Sandra offered them a soft, knowing smile and gracefully took her seat. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing any sign of defeat. But deep down, she knew the night was far from over. She tried to focus on the event, listening to speeches, watching presentations about the charity's mission, reminding herself why she was here. But then, something caught her attention. Eleanor and Vivian were whispering excitedly, their eyes glimmering with mischief. Something had sparked their interest. Curious, Sandra subtly shifted her position, tuning into their hushed conversation. And that's when she heard a name that made her heart skip a beat. Keanu Reeves. Vivian's voice carried a conspiratorial tone. Sandra's brows furrowed. What does Keanu have to do with any of this? Eleanor chuckled softly. Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it. A chill ran down Sandra's spine. There was something in their voices, something that didn't feel right. This wasn't excitement. It was something else. Something calculated. Sandra kept her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. What was really happening at this event? The ballroom buzzed with energy, guests settling into their seats as waiters moved with precision, serving exquisite dishes and refilling crystal glasses with the finest wine. Sandra already knew exactly who the host of the night was, Keanu Reeves. The charity gala was one of his most significant philanthropic projects, and he had invited her personally, assuring her that her presence mattered. And yet, when she realized that her assigned seat had been moved to a less prominent location, her surprise was mixed with disappointment. There was no way Keanu knew about this. Or did he? As she settled at her new table, the whispers didn't stop. It wasn't just the glances anymore, it was the words. And at the center of it all, Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian St. James. Sandra knew these women. Status was their lifeblood, and in their world, not displaying enough wealth was enough reason for exile. Eleanor's voice suddenly rang across the ballroom, coated in false amusement. Funny how this event brings together all sorts of people, don't you think, Vivian? Vivian smirked, playing along. Oh, absolutely. Some people think they belong here just because they were invited. But being invited doesn't mean you actually fit in. Sandra gripped her wine glass, feeling a slow burn in her chest. She knew they were talking about her. But what bothered her wasn't the insult. It was the fact that no one seemed to care. What started as subtle discomfort quickly escalated. The most powerful guests barely acknowledged her presence. Some greeted her with a forced smile, while others pretended not to see her at all. Sandra couldn't believe this was happening at Keanu's event. She had known him for years. She knew how much he valued purpose over appearances. So why was she being treated like an outsider? Then, as the main course was served, a waiter discreetly placed a folded note beside her plate. Sandra opened it, her eyes scanning the handwritten words. Sandra, darling, I hope you're enjoying yourself. If you ever need a proper dress for next year's event, I know some wonderful stylists. Kisses, Eleanor. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a passive-aggressive remark. This was a direct attack. and it had been delivered in front of everyone. She clenched the note slightly in her fingers before lifting her gaze. Across the room, Eleanor and Vivian were watching her, their lips curled in amusement, waiting, just waiting, to see if they had gotten under her skin. Sandra took a deep breath. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But now, she was certain. Something bigger was happening here. And she needed to find out what. Sandra wasn't leaving. But she needed a moment. She excused herself discreetly, stepping outside into the garden. The cool night air brushed against her skin as she took a sip of champagne, trying to process everything. Keanu invited me. He knows I don't care about extravagance. So why is this happening? She wouldn't have long to think. Because in that moment, she heard something that made her freeze. She was about to return to the ballroom when two familiar voices caught her attention. Eleanor and Vivian. They stood near the side entrance, speaking softly but excitedly. Sandra had no interest in eavesdropping until one name sent her heart racing. Keanu Reeves. Sandra's breath caught. What does he have to do with them? Vivian let out a hushed, knowing laugh. Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it. Eleanor smirked. Or maybe not. A chill ran through Sandra's spine. Something was going on. And for the first time that night, she felt truly uneasy. What were they planning? And what did Keanu Reeves have to do with this? Sandra needed answers. And she was about to get them. But what she would uncover would change everything. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you absolutely stunned. And Keanu's reaction? You won't see it coming. If you're loving this story so far, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments, what do you think is about to happen? Because trust me, this night is far from over. Something spectacular, something that would solidify their influence, maybe even a moment that would quietly humiliate Sandra once and for all. Sandra, however, remained relaxed. She had no doubt that whatever Keanu was about to say would not only silence her critics but redefine the entire tone of the evening. Keanu stepped onto the stage with his signature humility, dressed in a classic black suit, his presence commanding yet effortlessly approachable. The room fell silent as he took the microphone, his warm smile radiating authenticity, something that couldn't be faked, something money couldn't buy. Thank you all for being here tonight. Your generosity and commitment to this cause mean everything. Tonight isn't just about glamour, appearances, or exclusivity, it's about impact. It's about real change. Sandra watched as Eleanor and Vivian exchanged uncertain glances. That was not the speech they were expecting. And while this event brings together influential figures from all walks of life, there's one person here who deserves special recognition. Someone who has supported this mission, not because of status, not for public image, but because they genuinely care. The room held its breath. Keanu's eyes scanned the crowd, and then, without hesitation, he said, Sandra Bullock, please stand up. A ripple of surprise passed through the audience. Sandra exhaled slowly. This was not what Eleanor and Vivian had planned. With effortless grace, she rose from her seat, and suddenly, all the whispers, the judgmental glances, the calculated exclusions, they no longer mattered. Keanu continued. Sandra has been one of the biggest supporters of this initiative. She has donated generously, given her time, and asked for absolutely nothing in return. This event wouldn't be what it is tonight without her contribution. Silence. Then, applause. It started slow, hesitant from some, but then grew louder, more genuine, spreading through the room. Even those who had ignored her earlier were now clapping, realizing that their unspoken ranking of importance had been flawed from the start. Sandra smiled, not for validation, not for their approval, but because she knew this moment would be unforgettable for the two women who had spent the entire night trying to bring her down. She didn't even need to look at Eleanor and Vivian. She already knew this was a night they would never forget. And that, my friends, is what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. What do you think? Did Eleanor and Vivian get what they deserved? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we have another story that you won't want to miss, something spectacular. That was what everyone was expecting. Sandra, on the other hand, was simply curious. After all, what exactly was this surprise Keanu had planned? The ballroom, still buzzing with energy, fell into a hush as Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage with his usual effortless charm. Dressed in a classic black suit, his presence alone commanded attention. He took the microphone, waited for the room to settle, and then, in his signature calm and collected tone, he began. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. This cause means a lot to me, and seeing so many people come together to support it is truly incredible. The audience responded with another round of applause. The event was, after all, a symbol of status, philanthropy, and influence. But what came next? That was what intrigued Sandra. Keanu continued, his voice carrying effortlessly through the grand hall. Many of you are familiar with the work this organization does. But tonight, I want to take a moment to recognize someone truly special. Someone whose dedication and impact often go unnoticed, but who deserves to be acknowledged. Sandra raised an eyebrow. She was not expecting this. Keanu's words carried weight. His every sentence was deliberate. The room had gone completely silent, the anticipation palpable. This person has contributed immensely to charitable causes, not for publicity, not for praise, but because they genuinely care. Their generosity has helped change lives, yet they have never sought the spotlight for their efforts. Then, he smiled. I'm talking about Sandra Bullock. For a fraction of a second, the entire ballroom remained frozen. Then, applause. It began hesitantly, as though the crowd was trying to process what had just happened, but then it grew louder, spreading across the room. Sandra remained composed, her expression unreadable. But inside, she was amused. With practiced subtlety, she flicked a glance toward Eleanor and Vivian's table. The two women were stunned. This was the exact opposite of what they had anticipated. Keanu continued, undeterred by the silent shock still rippling through certain guests. What many of you may not know is that Sandra has been one of the biggest donors and supporters of this cause. She has not only contributed financially, but has been actively involved in ensuring these projects reach further than we ever imagined. The applause swelled even louder. Sandra smiled, not out of vanity, not because she craved recognition, but because of the looks on certain people's faces. Eleanor, usually the picture of composure, was struggling to maintain her poised expression. She tried to hide her discomfort behind a delicate sip of champagne, but the tension in her grip gave her away. Vivian, on the other hand, looked absolutely furious. They had spent the entire evening trying to diminish Sandra, trying to turn her into a social outcast among the elite. And now? Keanu had placed her at the center of recognition. Their plan had backfired spectacularly. Sandra watched, entertained, as Vivian leaned toward Eleanor, whispering something hurriedly. Eleanor's response came quickly, her voice tense, her eyes darting toward the stage. They were scrambling, desperately trying to find a way to salvage their reputation. But it was too late. The universe had a perfect sense of humor. Then Keanu turned to Sandra, his smile warm and inviting. Sandra, if you would, I'd love for you to come up here. Another wave of applause erupted. Sandra exhaled subtly, then smiled. For a brief moment, she considered declining. But then she saw them, Vivian and Eleanor. Their expressions were a mixture of shock and frustration. Irresistible. She set her glass down on the table and stood up with effortless grace. The room watched as she made her way toward the stage, her stride unhurried, her confidence unshaken. Every step felt like a quiet victory. As she reached Keanu, he handed her the microphone. The stage is yours. Sandra took a moment, scanning the audience. She hadn't prepared a speech. But she didn't need one. I find it amusing, she began, her voice smooth and unwavering, how people assume that doing good things means seeking recognition. But to me, helping others isn't about being in the spotlight. It's about making a real difference, whether people are watching or not. A murmur spread through the room. She continued, "Tonight, standing here and receiving this recognition is unexpected, but meaningful. Because it serves as a reminder that in the end, what truly matters isn't how we look, but the impact we leave in the world." The weight of her words settled over the audience. Some guests looked down, suddenly self-conscious. And at one particular table, Eleanor and Vivian sat motionless, their carefully constructed facades beginning to crack. Sandra allowed a small, knowing smile. Then, the applause returned, louder than before. She handed the microphone back to Keanu, turned, and walked off the stage at her own pace. But as she passed Eleanor and Vivian's table, she paused. Just for a second. She tilted her head slightly, met their eyes, and in a quiet, deliberate tone, said, "I hope you enjoy dinner." Then, without waiting for a response, she walked away. Neither of them spoke. Vivian clutched her wine glass so tightly it looked like it might shatter. Eleanor forced a tight-lipped smile, but the defeat in her eyes was undeniable. Sandra returned to her seat, picked up the glass she had left behind, took a slow sip, crossed her legs, and smiled to herself. The night had finally been worth it. As the audience continued clapping, the event began moving toward its conclusion. But then, Sandra noticed something. Vivian leaned in toward Eleanor. She whispered something. Sandra couldn't hear it. But she saw Eleanor's face shift from mere frustration to something else. Unease. Something wasn't right. After everything, after their humiliating defeat, what else could they possibly be plotting? Sandra wasn't sure yet. But one thing was certain. The night wasn't over. Not yet. Suddenly, the smiles were wider, the glances more inviting. Conversations that had been non-existent just hours ago were now being offered freely, as if the past few hours had never happened. But Sandra wasn't naive. She knew exactly what was going on. These people hadn't changed, they had simply realized they had been wrong. And if there was one thing they feared more than making a mistake, it was being on the losing side. It didn't bother her. But it certainly didn't impress her either. Across the room, Eleanor and Vivian remained seated, their previous confidence now gone. Vivian still held her wine glass, but she wasn't smiling anymore. The sharp amusement she had carried all night had disappeared, replaced by a distant, unreadable expression. Eleanor, always the picture of composure, sat stiffly in her chair, still trying to mask her discomfort behind an expression of forced indifference. But it was obvious. They had lost. Everything they had spent the night constructing, the exclusion, the whispers, the calculated glances, had crumbled in a matter of minutes. And the worst part? They had done it to themselves. Sandra had no interest in wasting any more time on them. But as she walked past their table, she overheard Eleanor's hushed whisper. She can pretend she doesn't care, but deep down, she just wants acceptance like everyone else. Sandra stopped. Slowly, she turned back toward them. Without hesitation, she pulled out a chair and sat down beside them, crossing her legs in one smooth motion. Then, with deliberate ease, she picked up a wine glass and took a slow sip. Only then did she speak. "Eleanor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "if I wanted acceptance from people like you, I would have shown up covered in diamonds, just to be considered worthy of this room. Don't you think?" Eleanor's face stiffened. Vivian looked away. Sandra continued. "The truth is, you spent the entire night trying to bring me down because you believe status is measured by what you wear, who you talk to, or how much you flaunt your wealth." She leaned in slightly. "But if tonight proved anything, it's that what really matters, the kind of respect that lasts, can't be bought." Eleanor forced a thin smile, her tone clipped. "You're overreacting. This event has always been for people of our world. Sandra tilted her head slightly, steadying her. And you really think you're at the top, don't you? She glanced around the room. Look at them. Who do you think they actually respect right now? Her gaze locked onto Eleanor's. Because from what I see, it's not you. Silence. Vivian opened her mouth as if to respond, but for the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. Sandra smiled, completely unbothered. Good luck fixing this. Then, without another word, she stood up and walked away. And this time, Eleanor and Vivian stayed silent. Because this time, they knew they had lost. Sandra crossed the room with ease, making her way toward Keanu. He had been watching from a distance, leaning casually against the bar, a knowing smirk on his face. As she approached, he lifted his glass toward her in an unspoken toast. Well played. Sandra chuckled and clinked her glass with his. If they think they can take me down with gossip, she mused, they're seriously underestimating my patience. Keanu smirked. You know what I find funny? How people cling so tightly to the idea of status, as if it actually means something in the grand scheme of things. Sandra nodded, glancing around the room. I saw so many people change their attitude after your speech, she said, amusement in her voice. As if public recognition from someone important suddenly determined my worth. Keanu exhaled. People need external validation to decide who deserves respect. But real respect? He shook his head. That doesn't need validation. Sandra turned to him, a knowing look in her eyes. And that's why you've never played this game, she said. You never cared about this whole performance. Keanu smirked. And that's why you never did either. I guess that's why we've always gotten along. Sandra laughed. Do you think people will remember this night? Keanu shrugged. Maybe some will. But most will go on believing that status and wealth are all that matter. Sandra looked over at Eleanor and Vivian, neither of whom were smiling anymore. Then, she looked back at Keanu. And others will remember it forever. Keanu nodded. Yeah. Some will. The night was over. As the event wound down, guests slowly began to filter out. Sandra and Keanu walked together toward the exit, past the chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the lavish decorations, all the things people had used as symbols of their supposed importance. But none of it mattered. Before getting into the car, Sandra took one last glance at the ballroom, the place that had started with so many false appearances and ended with undeniable truths. She turned back to Keanu and smiled. I think we learned something tonight. Keanu raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Sandra opened the car door but paused, looking at him one last time. It doesn't matter what you wear, who you associate with, or what people think of you. She smiled. The only thing that truly matters is who you are when no one is watching. Keanu returned her smile. And you've always known that. Sandra stepped into the car, and Keanu watched as she drove away. The event was over. But the lesson from that night? That would last far longer. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.